Hi everyone, it's Conrad Bobilak here, CEO of Investors Prime Real Estate and best-selling author of Australian Real Estate Investing Made Simple. Today's video is about tenants. And one of the biggest risks associated with owning an investment property portfolio and building your wealth through property is the risks associated with tenants. More specifically, getting the right tenants and avoiding the bad tenants, which there's plenty of them out there. And that comes down to really entrusting your portfolio with the right property manager who can really do that research and due diligence on the background of a tenant. And also, if you listen to my other YouTube videos, one of the biggest things that I always teach people is to avoid areas where there are problematic tenants. And when I talk about problematic tenants, I'm talking about the statistical probability of a tenant damaging or causing damage to your property or not paying your lease. And it really comes down to, especially in the COVID-19 environment, it comes down to the industry those people are working in. And we've seen in the last 12 months, some industries being decimated, like, for example, hospitality, tourism, and other industries like the medical sector and the banking sector, which I'm focusing on very heavily, have largely been unaffected. And those people who are fortunate enough to secure townhouses and properties in areas where people tend to work in those sectors have had really good experiences with tenants, and other areas in Melbourne have been really decimated, especially Docklands and South Bank. So it's very important for you to understand as an investor all the changes that are coming online with tenancy regulations, with tenancy laws that are changing. And I can tell you one thing that's happening as the division of wealth in Australia becomes wider and wider between property owners and people that rent, and we're going to have future generations of people that literally will be renting forever. What you're going to see is a very similar thing that has happened in Europe, in Poland and Germany, where my background, my parents are from and I'm from, is that there's going to be more and more laws targeting tenancy and eviction. And it's going to be always going in favour of the tenant away from the rich landlords, which is what's happened in Germany and Poland. It is very difficult to evict people in Poland and Germany unless you have a really good reason. And Australia is going to have to catch up to those policies and rules, whether you like it or not. It's the reality of where we are. So today what I've done is I've asked Cameron Fisher from Changing Places Real Estate to join us and give us a quick presentation on what's happening in tenancy laws and changes that are occurring this very month. In fact, they're kicking in. Cameron's been in real estate for over 35 years. He's been a director of some of the biggest real estate agencies in Victoria, if not in Australia. He's done 5,000 successful auctions. He's also contributed a chapter to my book, which is chapter number 23, on whether to self-manage your own investment property or not. And I can tell you, honestly, with my experience, 25 years in the industry, I would never manage any of my own properties. All my properties are with professional property managers, because you don't want to be taking those phone calls at 2 o'clock in the morning because the hot water system is broken or the toilet's not flushing. So you want to make sure that you have the right people. Not that they take those phone calls anyway, but I'm saying, you know what I mean. You want to make sure that you outsource all the things that are non-fun with holding a property portfolio and focus on the cool stuff that's really good. So I want to welcome Cameron. Thank you for giving up your time. I know your time is extremely valuable out there, and I want to really thank you for sharing this information with our investors and making their portfolio a little bit less riskier and giving them an insight in all the changes that are occurring this month and in future months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Conrad. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's certainly been an incredible last year, that's for sure. And just on Conrad's point, we used to still get phone calls at 2 a.m. in the morning. A lot of agents no longer have their mobile number available to tenants for that reason. But I can tell you now, we still do get lots of after-hour calls. But what an incredible year it has been. And it's been a very difficult year in a lot of ways for a lot of investors, because we've had a lot of difficulties with tenants being able to pay their rents. And what we've seen is that's put a lot of pressure on landlords being able to fund their properties. There's been shortfalls, there's tenants wanting discounts, there's tenants who can't pay at all, tenants who've lost their jobs, etc. And it's made it really difficult for a lot of landlords, and landlords across not only Melbourne but across Australia, obviously. And what we've seen, though, is one of the, I suppose, the silver lining is to the cloud is that we're going to see property prices really rebound strongly, which is what I spoke about this time last year, what would happen at the end of all of this. So that's great for investors and landlords to see that happen. but spare a thought for the property managers, because it has been a really difficult year, and there's been a huge number of property managers who have exited the profession because of the stress and the strain that's occurred over this last year. A number of them would rather take jobs in the public service, etc., where they can work from home a lot more and things like that. But it has been difficult because the property managers have really had to try and be the conduit between landlords and tenants. Got tenants on one hand saying, we can't pay our rent, we've lost our job, our hours are reduced, etc. And we've got landlords saying, well, we can't pay our mortgages, we need the rent to be able to pay those. So the property manager has been the meat and the sandwich and been caught between both and trying to do the very best they can. As property managers, our job is to the landlord. The landlord is the one who pays us, and it's our job to make sure that we manage their property in the best possible way. Every landlord wants to see their property leased for the highest amount in the quickest time to the best tenant, and that's what our job is, and that's what we try and do. But obviously, to have a great rapport with the tenant is also so important, so that we can make sure that tenant stays longer, which in the end saves the landlord considerably in the fact that he doesn't have vacancies, they don't have advertising fees and reletting fees. So it's really important for the property manager to work both sides of the fence and to really help both parties. So it has been a very stressful year, so when you speak to your property manager, thank them for the work that they've done, because they certainly deserve it, that's for sure. So today I'm primarily going to be talking about the Residential Tenancies Act Amendments 2021, which is a Victorian state government changes that have come into place, or they're coming into place at the end of this month, as in the end of March, and the impact that that's going to have on your investment property. And it is significant impact, that's for sure. Conrad gave the introduction about myself. I've been in real estate for nearly 40 years. I love real estate. It's fantastic. Auctions, sales, the whole shooting match, I love it. But I really have a soft spot for property management. I own a number of investment properties myself. I know how important it is for those properties to be managed properly. I know the difference between a good property manager and an average one. I know the difference between a good tenant and an average tenant. I know what it takes to make property management and owning investment properties successful. So I've been partner of some of the biggest real estate companies in Australia. I took Buy My Place to a publicly listed company, and I deal a lot for the major legal firms and accounting firms and helping them out with strategies, etc., for their businesses. But enough about me. What we're going to talk about, as I said, is the Residential Tenancies Act Amendments 2021. And you'll see that last year, the Andrews government brought in these changes. The changes were actually going to come in earlier, but because of COVID, they've been pushed back and they come into effect at the end of March this year. So they're very close by to taking effect. Now, there hasn't been changes for nearly 20 years. There's been some minor tweaks here and there, but 20 years ago was the last major overhaul of the Residential Tenancies Act. So the new legislation is brought in to give tenants minimum standards, and there's been over 130 rental reforms. If you were to look at the new Act, it's some 250 pages long, and it covers a lot of things. And it's mainly there, as Conrad was alluding to, that it's getting tougher on landlords, that you have to provide a minimum standard for your tenants, which is nothing wrong with that, that's for sure, and to make sure that they're well looked after and protected in this climate. It is probably a tough thing to bring in now when landlords are already struggling, and there's a number of points that come in that will affect landlords' ability to generate rents and costs that they'll have to bear the price of. So that's a little disappointing, but look, it happens and on we go. Okay, so why are we doing the changes? And the changes are there's more renters. Simple as that. Soon 40% of the population will be renters, partly because of affordability issues, but also because of lifestyle changes. A lot of people won't be able to afford to buy homes anymore. The cost of homes is going through the roof, particularly your typical house on a quarter-acre block is becoming more and more expensive. You then got, you see a lot of townhouse development happening now, because that's probably the next step down, is that people want low maintenance living. They not all want to be in an apartment, that they want that home where they're not within a community of 100, 200, 500 people that can be associated with apartment blocks. So they're looking for their home, but a lot of people still won't be able to afford that because the price of all properties continues to go up, and it always has. For the 40 years I've been in real estate, I've mentioned the story before. The first house I actually sold was $12,000 in St Kilda. It's now $1.2 million in value. It's gone up 100 times in value in just on 40 years. That's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal, and it'll continue to happen. Anyway, a lot of renters or tenants will now be long-term. They will be renting for the rest of their lives. And as I said, some people are happy to, because it allows them to change positions without the cost of stamp duty, without agents' fees, etc. They can just go from property to property, not have to worry about maintenance. That's the owner's responsibility. Not having to worry about owner's corporation fees. That's the owner's responsibility. So they can go from property to property and not have that concern about those costs themselves. Sometimes, though, they can suffer from length of tenure, that an owner can swap and change and decide to sell the property, etc. Some of these rules and laws have been brought in to protect the tenant more so with that. The government isn't providing enough social accommodation or enough accommodation overall, and it's up to us as landlords to be doing that, but to a point we foot the bill as well. Okay, one of the big changes, though, is terminology. And as we know, so many words are allowed and not allowed anymore, and so many changes are happening. I don't believe in all of them, but anyway, that's the way it's going. So renters are going to be called renters. They're not going to be called tenants anymore. So you can't say that my tenant this, my tenant that. They're renters. So from now on, they're called renters. It's going to be hard for me to change. It took me a long time to change from feet and yards to metric. This is going to be even harder for me. But anyway, we'll give it a go. And then no longer are you a landlord. That is elitist. You can't be a landlord anymore. You're a rental provider. So you're now all rental providers, not landlords. Again, a change. And instead of having lease agreements, they're rental agreements. So we've got renters, rental providers, and rental agreements. That's the way of the future, and they're the changes and the terminology that have come in with this Act. Okay. So as I said, there's a number of prescribed rental minimum standards that are coming in. And if we look at them, they're to ensure that there is a minimum standard across the board. And these will cover all sorts of things, such as the amenities, such as safety, and such as privacy. Because from now on, and it has been the case for a while, people are going to be renting for a long period of time. So renters, as they're now called, may be renting for all of their life. For the 50, 60 years of their adult lives, will be renting properties. And it's limited to a number of things that are changing. There's a lot of changes, and here are some of them. So locks and keys, that now you'll have to find that you've got to provide excellent security for your property. So if you read through these, you'll see that all external doors must be able to be locked. You've got to make sure that windows are capable of being locked if they're not already done so, and you've got to provide enough keys for everybody. Look, a lot of these things sound pretty standard and sound like we should be doing, and particularly with newer properties, townhouses, apartments, etc., they are standard. But the cost, again, to a landlord can be quite high, because some of these fobs are quite expensive that you've got to provide to tenants in apartment blocks. Also master keys, they're very specific keys that cost $140, $200 each, etc. So there are costs that the no longer landlord, that the rental provider must endure and make sure that everybody's got keys who are living in that property. So the number of tenants will increase your costs who are staying at that property. Also, window coverings, that all bedrooms must have windows. There's conditions in relation to mould and dampness. There's conditions in relation to heating, that there's a minimum standard of heating that must be provided. So a lot of our landlords predominantly own properties that are perhaps less than 10, less than 15 years old, and therefore they meet most of these standards. But if you're a landlord who owns a number of rundown older homes that are just becoming further and further dilapidated, you're the one who's got to watch out, because these rules and these changes to the legislation will impact on you severely. And you'll see how they're going to impact on you as we go by. But you've got to have energy efficient heating, etc., available in the living room as a minimum. We know now a lot of tenants are wanting are wanting reverse cycle heating, air conditioner in bedrooms, and that's going to help you get a higher rent, but obviously there's a cost involved. They've got to be checked electrical wise every couple of years, and also they have to be replaced, but they're things that can be allowed for with depreciation. So all these things have to be checked. They've got to meet the minimum standards. Now, I would sort of think, perhaps the back of my mind, well, some of these things are just over the top. Some of these electrical standards are just over the top. And are they being brought in to help the electrical trades union and provide more work, etc.? That's probably me being a little suspicious of why some of these changes are happening. At the end of the day, we want people to have safe accommodation for sure, but the cost of having these things continually checked year in, year out, or every second year, as some of the cases are, is a cost that the the rental provider must cover, and ultimately they have to pass it on to the tenant. So the renter in that circumstance will end up paying more. And again, the government's harping on that the cost of housing is too much, etc. But they're the ones who help pushing the cost up by having these extra costs borne by rental providers. Okay, so as I said, there's prescribed minimum requirements. You've got to make sure that the rental property meets those requirements. So it's really important that the property manager, and this is why it's more and more important to have a property manager than ever, because of all these onerous restrictions that are placed and requirements that are placed on you. You can't be in breach of the Equal Opportunities Act. There's so many things that you've got to make sure are included in leases now. If you've got a property that you're looking at selling, you have to let them know that you're going to be doing that. If you've got mortgage access, mortgage repossession, etc., against your problems, you've got to let the tenant know. You've got to also talk about any legal action that's against the property. Also, other things that you don't really think of. If there had been a murder in the property, you now have to let tenants know. If there was drug selling in the property, you have to let the tenants know. If there was drug use or growing drugs in the property, you have to let that renter know exactly what's been happening in the property. So the onus is very much on the agent or the landlord, if they're managing the property themselves, to have the tenant aware of all of these things. You'll see that I'll cross between tenant and renter. It's going to take me a little while, as I said, to get used to these changes of terminology. Anyway, another change, bonds. They cannot exceed 1 month's rent unless the rent exceeds $900 per week. So with the vast majority of properties, 1 month's rent is the highest bond that you can have. Now, that's always been a sore point for us agents, because if a tenant falls 1 month behind in their rent, there's the bond wiped out. And if there's any damage or any rubbish removal that needs doing to the property, carpet steam cleaned, etc., you're out of pocket because you don't have the money to do that. You can try and claim that money through a tribunal, but if the tenant's fled or the tenant's got no money, good luck trying to get that. So the way it works is you can't take a tenant for arrears to the tribunal until they're at least 2 weeks in arrears. And then by the time you actually get in front of the tribunal, as I said, it's nearly 28 days anyway, and that's how much rent you're owed. Unfortunately, we can't charge higher bond unless, of course, the property is let for $900 a week or more. And that quite often might happen or might be particularly relevant for properties that are furnished. So if a property is furnished, there could be a lot of furniture, knives, forks, etc., towels, all of that are included, and you want to have protection for that type of furniture that you're offering. Okay, modifications. A tenant can now make a lot of modifications to their property at their expense, but they're modifications that you can't reject to unless there's really good grounds to do so. So again, it's about allowing tenants to make their home a home, so that the renters move in and they do make it a home. And as a landlord or a rental provider, I want to see that, because if they make it a home and if the home's comfortable for them, they'll stay longer. So I have no problem, as long as they're not silly changes. You don't want really your lounge room painted black. You don't want other things to occur that are going to affect your property. but the renter must return the property back to its original condition if that's what you want. But a number of things that they can do is that they can put up picture hooks, they can secure things like TVs to a wall and other pieces of furniture to a wall, because we've seen problems with furniture falling on children and TVs falling on children, etc. That's understandable and certainly should be done. They can bring in safety measures such as cameras and alarms and things like that, as long as they don't affect other people's, as in neighbours, privacy, etc. And again, it's something that they can pack up, make good the repairs if there's wiring repairs, etc., and take it with them when they go. Security gates, fly-wire screens, they can bring in a vegetable garden or establish a vegetable garden and have better letter boxes and things like that. So they can do that now at their expense. As I said, I'm not so much concerned about that type of change, because if a tenant or renter makes your property their home and they're there for 5 or 6 years, that's great for you. As I said, you save on leasing fees, you save on advertising, and you save on vacancies. So that really is a big plus. Okay, electrical and gas safety compliance checks. So these are really new. Many of our rental providers, landlords, would be aware that we each year we encourage them to get the smoke alarms or smoke detectors checked, so that they're up to date, if they're hardwired or batteries replaced, so that they're in good working order. So if there is a fire, obviously the renter is protected and was given knowledge of a fire, and also it helps keep your asset, your property, from burning down. So that's great. But they've gone a step further now and having electrical and plumbing and gas requirements, so that each 2 years number of installations that you have in your home have to be checked. So that's going to be an ongoing expense that you're going to have to allow for every 1 to 2 years. So smoke detectors will still be a year, but you've got some of these other things that will need to be checked every 2 years. There will be a cost involved, and they're going to be around $250 to $300 to get your home checked when that occurs. Obviously, you want to pass that expense on. You might be able to if rents are strong and rents are going up. Obviously, that hasn't been the case over the last year, but things will sort themselves over time. The way it used to work with urgent repairs was that renters were allowed to spend up to $1,800 of your money without seeking your approval first on urgent repairs. So that might have been a hot water service blowing up, or the power goes out and they go and get an electrician or a plumber to fix that issue. This is probably something that is concerning to a lot of rental providers, landlords, that a tenant can go and spend their money like that. And Conrad mentioned before how that some renters might call you at night to call about problems. Very few agents are available at night. So some of them will have an emergency number to call, and you call their tradesperson, which is probably better that they're calling the agent's tradesperson rather than just someone out of the phone book or just Googling the local person. That it's someone that we trust and we obviously use. But our property managers still have their phones at night. Our tenants still have their mobile number. If it's a real emergency, we do want to hear from them, because there's a chance that it may not be as big a problem as they thought. There's a chance that the so-called urgent repair can wait until tomorrow and not have a tradesperson come out at after-hour rates that's so expensive. And there's a chance that we might be able to solve the problem on the phone. Now, we've had a number of cases where a renter has called us and said, oh, the power's out, I need to get an electrician, we can't turn the lighting on, we can't turn the oven on, we can't cook, we can't have dinner, we need them on urgently. Sometimes it's as simple as the fuse switch is just switched and we need to switch it back. Or we might say, is everybody else in the development got their lights out, or is it just you? And they go outside and they say, oh, everyone's out. Well, then that's not an electrician's job to do, that's the power company, etc. So if they had have gone and spent your money getting an electrician in and the electrician couldn't do anything about it, you end up with a bill of $350 and the problem hadn't been solved. So it's really important that if you have a quality property manager, that they are available to help renters with these sorts of issues. And again, a property manager that owns property themselves know about this sort of thing. They feel the pain of unnecessary expenses being incurred. They want to keep costs down on their own investment properties, just as they do on yours. So that's really important. But that figure's now gone up from $1,800 to $2,500, including GST, for renters to be able to spend straight off. And we've had people that have said, oh, look, the tap's leaking. I need an urgent plumber. And you say, well, how long's it been leaking? I need to get one tonight. How long's it been leaking for? Oh, 2 weeks. Well, it's not an urgent repair. The plumber can go there the next day and do a number of things while he's there at the one time. Okay, rent increases. So new amendments say that you can only increase the rent every 12 months. So it was the case before where you could increase rent at different times and every 6 months if you wanted to, etc. It wasn't a practice that we really took part in. Every year we thought was more fair. Every time you go to increase rent, you run the risk of a tenant leaving, because every tenant is likely to weigh up and say, well, should I stay? Is the rent fair? Maybe I should go. So you don't want to raise that prospect 2, 3, 4 times a year. Once a year is enough. So it's always been our practice, unless there's been very unusual circumstances, to only increase every 12 months. The issuing of rent increases can now start once that COVID-19 legislation and amendments have been repealed, which is going to be at the end of March, that we can start putting rents up and going on there, because there was a moratorium on rents, that rents couldn't go up. I don't really think it's affected the market that much, because a lot of rents have come down, particularly in inner Melbourne. An example of how it's changed is we have properties in Mornington. Mornington's booming at the moment because people wanted that sort of sea change. They believe they're going to be working more from home, so they were happy to go and rent, say, down in Mornington and down on the peninsula, where they can have that work-life balance and have a better quality of life. So rents in those areas have gone up, whereas in inner city Melbourne, a lot of rents have come down by as much as 10% and even more in some cases. So you've got those things occurring with rent increases. Also now, you've got to show why you're increasing the rent and that it's justifiable to increase the rent. And again, having a good property manager who has a good knowledge of where rents are heading, a good knowledge of what's happening, who follows the market, follows the economy, has a good understanding of where it's at, is really important. It's so easy for a lot of property managers to say to you, oh, don't put the rent up, things are tough, it's too hard, because they don't want to do the work. You want a property manager who's on top of you, who says to you, if the rent shouldn't go up, these are the reasons why, and gives you some comparisons to say this is it. Or if the rents should go up, these are why, because another one in the block just let for $20 more, others in the neighbourhood let for more. That's important, because now you'll have to justify that to a renter. So if a renter says, well, why are you putting the rent up $20 a week? You want a property manager who can say, well, consumer price index is running at X, or another one in the block is let for $20 a week more. We believe yours is the same. So again, it's important that the property manager knows that, but now you have to justify that. It's always been the case that a tenant, if they believe the rent increase was too large, could go to the tribunal and argue that it's excessive. But that rarely happened, and tenants or renters rarely use that avenue. But now it'll increasingly be more the case. Again, ending a tenancy used to be quite relatively easy. If a tenant was causing trouble, if they're late with their rent, there's a whole lot of reasons why you can have a tenant leave and leave earlier. And that's sort of changing to a point. You can still give notice because of repairs and renovations that need doing to the property, also of demolition, change of use of the premises, that it might be being used for a different purpose now. Also that yourself wants to move into the property or your family wants to move in. They're grounds that you can still use to ask a tenant to leave, or the premises are to be sold and for public purposes, or that the renter no longer meets the eligible criteria. And that could be due to a number of things, could be government subsidies, etc. But you can't just now end a tenancy after the first term for no reason. And that's where we have this here. Rental providers must give a reason to end a rental agreement. The no specific reason, which was a 120-day notice, to vacate the periodic residential agreement has been abolished. So you can't just say, I just want you out, I don't have to give a reason, you won't be able to do that any longer, which was potentially a way for an agent to get rid of a troublesome renter who might have paid their rent on time, might have kept the place good, but they're causing, let's say, problems with other people in the block, that they're being a real nuisance, upsetting everybody, causing difficulty. So now you've got to go about that in different ways, and there'll be warnings and things like that given. But that is a change that's occurring. This one's a good one. Compensation for sales inspections. Renters will be entitled to financial compensation for inspections during a property sale campaign. So the prescribed compensation is the equivalent of 1/2 of the daily amount of rent payable under the lease, or $30, whichever is the higher amount. So if a tenant's rent if they're paying $700 a week, they're paying $100 a day, 50% is $50. That's higher than the $30 minimum. So we would have to compensate the tenant $50 for that day of showing the property for sale purposes. Now, some tenants or renters won't ask for it. It's a bit of quo pro that you help each other out, that if it's not going to be much trouble. Some renters won't worry about it, but there's some who will be sticklers for it. And it's okay at the moment with the property market booming. Properties, you hear stories sell in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, auctions, 80, 90% clearance rate. So a 4-week campaign, you might do 1, 2, 8 inspections in total. So at $50 an inspection is going to cost you $400. And that's what you will have to provide to the tenant for the right to do those inspections. The issue is that if it's a private sale and the market toughens up and it takes 1, 2, 3, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months to sell a property, and some stay on the market for 2 years, and there's ongoing inspections, the cost could add up quite considerably. I suppose the advantage is the clarity aspect is that you can now say to a renter that we need to show people through, but you are compensated for it. So it takes away that grey area of renters saying, I don't want you through, it's an inconvenience to my life. Well, it's now part of the legislation that they can be rewarded or compensated for us showing people through that property. So will it push more owners to selling over shorter campaigns, such as going to auction, because it means less cost? We're going to have to wait and see. But certainly it does give renters that protection. But we find that if we have a really good relationship with the renter and talk to them about the possibility that the new buyer might be an investor who will keep the property as an ongoing investment, and we would gladly recommend them as an ongoing renter, then that can help with the process. So it's just critical that the property manager has that great relationship, not just with you, the landlord, but also with the renter, because it will save you money, will save you time. It might be okay to pay the renter $30 a day for inspection, but there's nothing in there that says that they've got to have it looking good. There's nothing in there that says they can't have 10 mates in there all sitting around drinking beer while you're trying to show their property. So that's where that relationship is just critical when trying to sell a property under these circumstances. So we've had what does it mean for landlords? Well, there's going to be new costs. As I said, there's the cost with having your electrical and gas appliances checked on a regular basis. That's potentially going to lead to higher rent, which I said was what the government didn't want, but they're going to be the ones that are pushing this. It's going to make extra costs for mum and dad investors, and some of them will exit the market. They just say, we can't afford this. It's all right in a low interest rate environment where interest rates have come down and therefore mortgage repayments have come down. That has helped dramatically with the drop in rents that has occurred. But if people weren't having that relief, and also a lot of people took the relief from the banks where you didn't have to pay your repayments for 6 months, that's obviously changed. But if people have to pay more out, as in our landlords or rent providers have to pay more money out, they're going to need that to come in. Otherwise, they'll walk away from the rental market, which again will just lead to less properties available and will push rents up. So it'll have the opposite effect to what the government's trying to achieve. As I said, the property manager is now more important than ever, and so is the property manager's rapport with the renter, the tenant, because they just need to have that great relationship so that a lot of these things, whilst they're for renters' protection, are things that we've always done anyway. So it's just putting them into legislation, so to speak. But if you can have that relationship where they don't go and spend that $2,500 on emergency things being done, where they don't ask for an arm and a leg to have their property for you to show people through when you're selling, that they're just helpful all the way along, and that they make your property their home for 3, 5, 10 and 15 years instead of tenant swapping every year or so is a big benefit. There's no question about that. So what we'll see is if you've got property managers that are managing too many properties, they're not going to be able to cope. They haven't been able to cope in the past. There's so much more obligation on property managers now. How are they going to cope in the future? As I said, there's a number of things you should look for in a property manager. One, do they own property themselves, particularly investment properties themselves, so they know the pain of rent not coming in. They know the pain of repairs and maintenance. They know all of those things so that they can work in your favour to make sure that we're keeping costs to a minimum, keeping rents up. But if you've got a property manager that's looking after too many properties, a lot of these things will go unchecked, which could lead to far greater expenses later. The last thing you want is a tenant seeking compensation because your property manager hasn't done their job properly. And there's a lot of things within these changes that a property manager must be responsible for and must make sure they happen. As I said, at Changing Places, we've always made sure that our property managers have low numbers of properties to manage and they manage them well so that we can be across all of those things. It has been a very hard year with all the pressure, but it's been a hard year for most of Victoria and particularly Melburnians with everything we've been through, but just trying to manage that is important. So the other statistic is that 71% of property investors only buy one residential investment property. So just 71%. And the reason is because they've had a terrible property management experience. It's just the way it happens. If you have a problem where there's major expenses because maybe a property manager didn't inspect the property every 6 months as they're allowed to do, to see that there was problems occurring and nip those problems in the bud before they became too big. And you see that there might have been a leak behind some tiles that if had been addressed quickly might have been a $300 or $400 job, but because they weren't addressed, the water went down into the flooring, into the walls, and it ended up being a $15,000, $20,000 job. That's what can happen. That sort of experience stops someone buying their second investment property. So it's also long-term vacancies. It's also problems with tenants who skip because the property manager was too busy to do proper checks. They're all things that can happen that will continue to make it difficult to stay in the investment market because it's so critical that you're getting your rent to pay your mortgage, as simple as that. So as I said, it's so critical to have the right property manager. You've got to make sure more than ever that they're on top of their job. It's just so important. So, should I be selling? This is interesting. I wanted to take you back to this slide, whoever saw my presentation last year, because I had so many landlords or rental providers, as they're now called, asking, COVID, it's going to be a disaster, I need to sell, I want to sell, I must sell. I had so many landlords, renter providers coming to me saying, Cameron, what's my property worth? Should I put it on the market? And I said to so many of them, don't sell. You're going to be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're going to see it's going to be nearly impossible to sell in some cases because we had those long periods of no open for inspections whatsoever, no auctions whatsoever. We couldn't show anybody a property. So it would have been a disaster trying to sell in that market. And I said to everybody, this is the slide from last year before we got fully into the swing of it. In April last year, I said that there would be significant increase in property prices once this was over, or once we were on top of it, or once we had seen the worst of it. And that is exactly what's happening. So all my rental provider landlords are now in a much better position. They're going to see rises of 5, 10, 15, 20% over the next 1 to 2 years. So they're just so much better placed now than where they were. Interest rates are so low. We've gone through the toughness of rents being in decline. Hopefully when people are allowed back into Australia, we're going to see rents continue to increase. Obviously, there's problems with wages not going up in terms of people's propensity to be able to pay more, but it's going to be a lot rosier on that side. As I said, the low interest rates helped so many of us through all of this, but the big thing, as I said at the start, the silver lining is the fact that property prices are going up. Houses are going through the roof. And what will happen is that townhouses and then ultimately apartments prices will increase as well, because they are dragged up, because the gap between houses and townhouses and apartments becomes too great that people will go to the next level down and buy those properties. And particularly as you've got so many first home buyers, has not been a better time in probably 30 years to buy property. You've got record low interest rates. You've got prices about to boom. You've got just huge concessions on stamp duty. The stamp duty concessions only 50% and 25% are nil in some cases. I mean, there is no better time for people to be buying now. So those first home buyers should be pinning their ears back and getting straight into property now, because they will probably not see another opportunity like this for 5, 10, 20 years, if ever. So you're going to see a good, strong real estate market over the next at least 1 and I'm sure 2 years and maybe even 3 years. So to all our rental providers, our landlords who held on, who made ends meet, who perhaps had to make sacrifices, I really hope that they get the benefits of doing that, because it'll be great to see everyone come out better, as I predicted back in April last year, at the end of all this. So that's it from me. I hope that's giving you an understanding of the changes that have come in. I've only briefly gone over them. As I said, the acts, the amendments are some 250 pages, 130 different changes. Some of them relate to boarding houses and other forms of accommodation, but there are a lot of changes there. As I said, ultimately, some of it will be for the good. Some of it will be a burden to rent providers. But ultimately, as rents start to increase, hopefully that will compensate for it. But I don't want you to be one of the 71% of investors who only ever own one investment property. I want you to have a fantastic property management experience, have a fantastic property manager, and buy more and more property as you go on. Look, there will always be mistakes. There will always be headaches. There will always be heartache. As I said, I own a lot of property myself, and there's always a problem here, there, or whatever. You've got to allow for that. You've got to factor in it. But if you can get 10, 15% growth on your properties, on the equity in your properties as well, over the next year, 2 years, it's going to be well worth it, that's for sure. So there are my details. If you need to contact me, send me an email, give me a call. I'm here to help you. So is my team. We're always here to help you. And hopefully you'll go on and buy more and more investment property. And in the years to come, you won't be selling a property to buy another to live in. You'll be selling a property, and that money will be yours to spend as you wish to in your retirement, towards kids' school fees, whatever it is. The more property you buy, the more independence, financial independence you'll have to do the things you want to in life. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you got something from that. Thank you very much. It's always great to work with Conrad. As he said, there's a chapter in his latest book that I've written on property management. So make sure you have a read of that, and by all means, call me with any queries or questions you've got. Thank you very much.